Good morning, everyone. Thank you to the Greenwich Board of Realtors and to the Greenwich Historical Society for this invitation to speak with you today. It's great to be back here with Deborah Mecki and Davida Strackbein and Katie DeLuca and Pat Sestro, four people who have done a lot to preserve the history and the character of Greenwich and for whom I have a great deal of respect. Before we get started, let me just mention a few caveats. First, I come at this from a very practical perspective, practicing architecture here for the past 34 years. Most of my time has been spent dissecting old houses in the goal of designing renovations and additions to homes or new homes that are historically sensitive in and around Greenwich. Davida did a wonderful job outlining the history of Greenwich. And as a practitioner, not a historian, my comments will focus mainly on art, on composition, and on the construction of homes, rather than any kind of historical analysis. Second, we do have very limited time, have nearly 400 years of history to cover in 40 minutes, and so I'm going to need to move very quickly and at a very high level to cover these trends and influences, and I apologize in advance for speeding through a lot of this material. As far as resources, I relied heavily on reference books such as Building Greenwich, as the Great Estates book, and the Field Guide to American Houses, supplemented by some great information from the Historical Society, thanks to Chris Shields. So if you're interested in these would be great supplemental resources to look at in addition to our book, Classic Greenwich Houses, if you want to learn more. So with that, let's dive right in. So as a background for understanding the history of homes in Greenwich, I think it's first helpful to review the evolution of architectural styles, the evolution of building technologies and how they impacted buildings' forms, and the evolution of building envelopes. Architectural styles fall into two broad groups: vernacular homes and stylized homes. Vernacular homes provide basic shelter from the elements with simple spaces for living, cooking, and sleeping. These were typically built by their occupants who were non-professional builders or architects and were constructed of indigenous materials without any attempt to be fashionable. Stylized homes, by contrast, are influenced by world affairs, cultural expression, and evolving technologies that influenced how and when these various styles emerged. They attempt to be fashionable either in their shape, in their materials, or detailing to reflect an architectural trend that's currently in vogue. And there's a number of these stylistic inspirations, notably the ancient classical traditions, medieval traditions, Renaissance traditions, and modern or industrial-inspired traditions. There's a lot of other smaller, more minor regional traditions, and certainly a lot of hybrids between all those, but it's the first four, which are the primary ones that I'd like to focus on today. The first major stylistic influence is the ancient classical styles. This refers to the architecture of ancient Greece and Rome, Greece from the period of 800 to 150 BC and Roman from 100 BC to roughly 476 AD. Architectural precedents for the style include buildings such as the Parthenon, the Roman Pantheon, and the Palace of Diocletian. Some of the identifying features of the ancient classical styles include symmetrical facades, pediments with low-pitched roofs, entry or full-size porches that are supported by large columns, which are frequently 2 stories, and are done in one of the classical styles, sometimes round, square, or octagonal in shape. The derivative styles that we see in residences from these ancient classical styles include the Greek Revival, early Classical Revival, and neoclassical style houses. The second major stylistic influence are the medieval styles. These are based on the architecture of the Middle Ages, from the 6th to 15th century AD, from the Romanesque period, from the 9th to the mid-12th century, and from the Gothic period from the mid-12th century to the 15th century. Here we see examples from around Europe, both in England and in France, and see identifying features such as steeply pitched roofs, asymmetrical facades, prominent chimneys, exposed half timbering, and overhanging upper stories, which are all common. We see a wide variety of derivative styles from the medieval. They fall into 2 broad groups. From medieval, we see post-medieval, Gothic revival, stick style, some Queen Anne, Richardson Romanesque, and most Tudors. And then we see others that have some classical detailing, which include some Queen Anne, Chateauesque, shingle style, and other Tudors. The third stylistic influence was that of the Renaissance. Andrea Palladio was probably the most famous architect of the Italian Renaissance. He's significant because up until this time, the most important and significant architectural work in classicism was being done for the church and in some cases the state. Palladio was really the first to adopt these sacred forms and classical architecture to private residences. Here you see some examples of his work in the Villa Rotonda and the Plaza Bartolini, and on the left side, his 4 books of architecture, the second book, which is the most influential on residential design, and in the center, a map showing the spread of the Renaissance style across Europe, starting in Italy in the early 15th century, hitting the center of Europe around the mid-16th century, then spreading in early 17th century to England, and eventually over to the United States in the 18th century. While interpretations of Renaissance varied by country, they all shared balanced symmetrical facades, decorative details such as pediment, doors and windows, dentils, coins, and pilasters. But there's also differences that we see from one region to the other. From the Italian Renaissance, we see an emphasis on arches, classical cornice lines, and brackets. From the French style, we see very steeply pitched roofs, and later mansard roofs are common. And from the English, we see an emphasis on elaborate front door surrounds, which usually have pilasters and support a pediment or some kind of entablature or fanlight over the door. The derivative styles we see from the Renaissance influence include from the Italian, Italianate, and Italian Renaissance, from the French, Second Empire, Beaux-Arts, and French Eclectic, and from the English, Georgian, Adams or Federal style, and the Colonial Revival styles. The fourth major influence in terms of styles was the modern styles, and we have 2 major trends. One is the arts and crafts movement, which favored decoration and design over historical precedent and resulted in the prairie style and craftsman style. And second, the machine age movement, which really began in earnest after World War I and focused on the standardization of parts, absence of non-functioning decoration, and structural honesty as seen in the modern style and the international style. Here we see some examples of the Prairie style and the Roby House by Frank Lloyd Wright and the Blacker House by Green and Villa Stein and the Farnsworth House, examples of the machine age or international style. So moving on from styles, let's talk about building technologies and their related influence on building forms. So first, on the technological innovations and how they influence building forms, we're going to take a look at roofing materials, at heating technologies, at framing technologies, and the integration of garages. So let's talk about roofing materials. Although thatch was common on most European dwellings, it was quickly abandoned by the American colonists because it was particularly vulnerable to our high winds, driving rains, and severe winters. They also tried board roofing, seen here on the Thomas Lyon House, before moving on to wood shingles, seen in the later version of the Thomas Lyon House. And these transitions of roofing materials over time allowed lower pitched roofs and much more complex shapes to the colonial homes. The next technology I'd like to touch on is heating innovations. Originally, the medieval houses upon which the colonial houses were modeled had no chimneys, but rather had open floors with thatched roofs that allowed the smoke to dissipate up through the roof. Some of the early colonial houses had wood-framed chimneys with clay lining, but the laws of physics and natural selection made these short-lived. Most had large central chimneys, and some had side perimeter chimneys. The idea was that the chimneys were centrally located in order to effectively radiate heat. And you can see the diagram at the bottom left showing kind of a placement of chimneys in the house. The advent of the cast iron stove minimized the necessity for chimney size and allowed more flexibility in floor plans. Later, centralized furnaces and boilers continued this evolution, and today we know we have many homes that don't even need chimneys with direct vent or and other things like geothermal and high efficiency heat pumps are making centralized chimneys completely unnecessary. The fourth technology innovation I'd like to discuss is framing innovations. The early homes in the colonies were typically framed post and beam. This meant that trees were cut and were shaped into timbers using tools such as an adze, which is an axe with a turned head, a very broad face, and then very difficult compound cuts were done to form corners and make connections, and therefore building shapes remained fairly simple to minimize the amount of work that was needed to create these timber connections. In the late 1800s, framing transitioned to balloon framing, which used saw-cut lumber connected by wire nails. These were easy, cheap, and very flexible and allowed building forms and plans to get more complex. And then today, we have moved on to platform framing and frame our buildings one story at a time, relying on regular lumber, but also composite lumber, steel connections, and often integrating steel into the construction. And this allows much more complex and larger spans in building framing. Final technological innovation I'd like to touch on is the invention of the automobile and the integrations of garages into homes. Americans began purchasing automobiles during the first few decades of the 20th century. Garages were often detached and then became integrated into house floor plans, and over time, 2 and now 3 or more car garages have become very common and have become substantial elements in the design of homes, often taking up whole wings or large parts of lower levels of floors. So based on these better roofing products, advanced HVAC options, more flexible and manufactured framing products and methods, and the integration of garages and the increased size of house over time, and a number of other factors, we see house plans evolving from very simple to much more complex shapes. And you can see in the diagrams above the evolution from linear plans to LT and U-shaped plans to some very complex plan shapes that have happened. So not only has the plan gotten more complex, but so have the house volumes. And here we see examples from low one-story buildings to multi-story buildings with very complex shapes. The next evolution we should touch on is the evolution of the building envelope. And while there's a lot of things we can talk about, I'm going to focus on cladding, materials, and doors and windows in particular. So the first things I'd like to talk about is cladding evolutions. Historically, masonry walls were constructive solid masonry. They were the development of masonry veneer cladding over wood framing structure by the mid-1920s made a wide variety of stylistic expressions in masonry, both practical and affordable. And in the slide here you see the evolution from kind of rustic masonry to cut masonry to block with some kind of masonry veneer, and eventually wood with some kind of masonry veneer. In this slide, we see the development of roofing materials. The top row shows an evolution of organic types of roofing material I mentioned earlier, from thatch to woodboard to shingles. In Greenwich, we see plenty of mineral-based roofs, such as slate and ceramic tile. And in the mid-19th century, we see a significant increase in metal roofing and accents. There was some tar roofing products that were being used in the Colonial days, but these have developed in an increasing number of forms, and with chemical stability has greatly improved through the years. So today we see a great number of asphalt shingle roofs, which are used not only in Greenwich but across the country. Not pictured but prevalent today is also use of a number of composite materials such as EPDM rubber roofing, or products like Kemper, which is a reinforced epoxy for flat roofs. And overall, the result of these roofing improvements and developments have resulted in roofs that could be much shallower and could have much more complex shapes. Window and door glazing has also had a significant number of developments through the years, starting with really unglazed windows and doors, then starting with leaded glass, small panes of float glass connected by a thin bar of lead caming. This transitioned to early colonial period where we saw wood muttons connecting, again, pretty small panes of glass, but then later, as the glass technology got better, the panes of glass got larger and the bars actually got a bit thinner. This evolution continued in the Victorian period, where you see even larger panes of glass, until the 20th century, where you see windows with one large sheet of glass. And today, we have a whole bunch of options in thermally insulated glass, double glazed, triple glazed, things like low E coating and laminated glass that all allow larger, more stable windows and doors and better viewing and connection between the inside and outside of a residence. So with that background, now let's take a look at the history of residential design in Greenwich over the past 3.5 to 4 centuries. We'll begin by looking at examples of homes in styles from Greenwich's colonial settlement period from roughly 1640 to 1790. First, we have examples of the early vernacular houses. These homes had linear boxy plans, solid masonry or timber frame walls with boards or shingle siding, typically had a large central chimney or end wall chimneys, had small windows with no glazing or very little panes of glass, and very little or no exterior decoration. Some examples here: the Solomon Merritt House, the oldest known masonry house in Greenwich, the Benjamin Mead House, 1.5-story salt box, the large with a large central chimney and kind of smallish windows, no real overhang, and the Brown Kensworthy House, which what looks like the wing was actually the original part of the house, and then the addition is the newer, larger piece of the house. The Dutch colony of New Netherland extended up to Greenwich for a short period in the 17th century, and here we see a diagram of it spreading through the Hudson Valley from New York out into Connecticut. From this Dutch influence, we have homes with things like side gabled roofing having little or no rake overhangs, flared eaves. The materials were frequently stone walls or decorative wood shingles, like you see here in Putnam Cottage. Entry doors were frequently divided top and bottom, that we commonly refer to today as Dutch doors. And when they're outgrown, we see new, larger additions, which were often an extrapolation of the original form and built in a linear sequence, sometime in 2 or 3 pieces, with the smallest typically being the oldest piece. Next, we see many fine examples of early colonial architecture. These were typically rectangular, heavy timbered structures with board or shingle siding, most often built as or developed in a salt box shape, with a central chimney and small windows and very small panes of glass, and again, very restrained exterior decoration. We see the Feek Ferris House is Greenwich's oldest surviving structure, and a little diagram of its timber frame there. The Bush Holly House, which right next door to us, and the Thomas Lyon House, another familiar landmark in Greenwich. We also see Georgian homes, which originated in England roughly 1650 to 1750 and refers to the reigns of Kings George I through the IV during the English Renaissance. Georgian architecture was developed by English architects such as Inigo Jones, Christopher Wren, and James Gibbs, and spread to the U.S. through architectural pattern books and inexpensive carpenter's handbooks. And here you see examples of these 3 architects, their pattern books, and some examples of their work. The Queen's Residence by Inigo Jones, Christopher Wren's St. Paul Church, and James Gibbs' Library at Oxford and King's College. Back in Greenwich, we see this influence from roughly 1700 to 1790, winding down into the early 1800s. The Georgian homes often had paneled front doors, which were usually centered and capped by sometimes elaborate crowns supported by decorative pilasters, usually with a row of small rectangular panes of glass beneath the crown, decorative elements such as the tooth-like dentil moldings, and these houses often had hipped or gabled roofs or sometimes gambrel roofs. They had double hung windows, but these were small panes, and you can see in the Belden house there the small panes. Often these were 9 or 12 panes per sash, and also kind of a strict alignment of these windows, both horizontally and vertically, into symmetrical rows. Most commonly, maybe 5 across, but less commonly 3 or 7, but never paired. The windows were always kind of single units. The next broad period I'd like to take a look at is Greenwich's agrarian period, which is roughly from 1790 to 1850. During this period, we saw the Federal or Adamsesque architecture, which drew on the work of the Adams brothers in Great Britain and was really a further development of the Georgian style, incorporating a lot of Palladian influences. It was one style that was well established in the U.S. and favored by a lot of wealthy New England merchants. We see a continued emphasis on decoration at the door surrounds. Cornices emphasized with decorative moldings. We see double hung windows, now more commonly having 6 pane sashes separated by thin wood muttons. Windows still lined horizontally and vertically into symmetrical rows, and hip roofs become more common, but again, lots of gable roofs also. And on this slide, you can see the example of that emphasis at the front door with a beautiful fan light and side lights at the John Waterbury house in nearby Darien. So this leads us up to the middle of the 1800s. This period followed the War of 1812 and really marked a rejection of the English influence and a transition to a variety of continental European-inspired picturesque styles of design. These styles celebrated texture and variety in an effort to emphasize poetry over order. It was also a transition from really a singular architectural style to a period that emphasized a very pluralistic view of style over the mid-19th century. By 1840, we see a competition beginning between the architectural styles. Andrew Jackson Downing's cottage residences represented Gothic Revival and Italianate as alternatives to the Greek Revival style, and other less popular styles from around the world were also gaining acceptance. The development of balloon framing freed designers to choose how to decorate these domestic buildings, and the arrival of the railroad in Greenwich in 1848 helped make available affordable assembly line parts and embellishments to integrate into these late 19th century styles. The Greek Revival style predominated up until the Civil War, and then after the Civil War, the Italianate really became most prominent. Gothic Revival houses were more complex to build and therefore were significantly less common during this period. Architectural models evocative of the Greek democracy came to be found especially appropriate for the New Republic, as it was a rejection, as it rejected the traditional ties to England in the decades after the War of 1812. Archaeological discoveries helped shift interest to these new Grecian models. American sympathies for the newly independent Greek state also played a role in the establishment of Greek Revival architecture, and the front-faced gabled house is an important and enduring legacy of the Greek Revival style that continues to evolve, that we'll see in the Gothic Revival, Italianate, Queen Anne, shingle style, and Colonial Revival homes. Identifying features of the Greek Revival architecture include low-pitched roofs, which were often gabled or sometimes hipped, cornice lines of the main roof or the porches that emphasized wide bands of trim with classical moldings. Most had entryways or full-width porches that were supported by prominent, very tall columns, either in the Doric style or sometimes Ionic style, and front door surrounds that had narrow side lights and rectangular transom lights above. The Gothic Revival period began in England in 1749 when Sir Horace Walpole boldly remodeled his country house in the predominantly ecclesiastical style of Gothic. Others followed his lead, and by the mid-19th century, Gothic architecture was being tied to the national identities of countries like England and France by architectural theorists like Ruskin and Viollet-le-Duc. The style was particularly well suited to the rural settings where multiple steeply pitched gables and wide porches had ample breathing room. And in areas like Greenwich, in Greenwich we see mainly Carpenter Gothic, which was a wood version of Gothic architecture. And here you see some examples from around Greenwich, including our first railroad depot. A good example of Carpenter Gothic is his home on Post Road in Darien, where you could see all the elements of this Carpenter Gothic, from steeply pitched roofs that often had crossing gables, decorative barge boards along the roof line, wall surfaces that extended all the way up into the gable. These were frequently vertical. In this case, it happened to be horizontal. Windows commonly had pointed arches in kind of a Gothic shape, and you also saw kind of one-story porches with kind of flattened Gothic arches, all from this Carpenter Gothic period. Next, we have the Italianate. The Italianate style, like the Gothic Revival style, evolved out of the Picturesque movement in England. It sought to mimic the rambling, informal Italian farmhouses with their characteristic square towers. These old world prototypes were modified, adapted, and embellished to create a truly indigenous style that was very different from the austere Renaissance predecessors. In the Italianate, we see identifying features such as 2.5, and 3-story facades, low-pitched roofs with wide overhanging eaves having decorative brackets beneath, tall narrow windows commonly arched on the top stories, and windows with frequently elaborate crowns, and many had square cupolas or towers. And some more nice examples of Italianate homes from around Greenwich. From 1850 to 1895, Greenwich transitions from being a really agrarian community to a summer community, and eventually to a full-time New York bedroom community. Here you see a nice view kind of looking down Greenwich Avenue. The one-track line of the New England Railroad came in, like I mentioned earlier, 1848. It soon expanded, making Greenwich much more accessible to New Yorkers looking to escape the city. William Boss Tweed was one of the first to build his country house on Greenwich Ave, not to mention his private America's Club on Greenwich Harbor. The placement of his house Linwood at the corner of Putnam Ave and Millbank Ave started a trend which made Putnam Ave in central Greenwich a posh boulevard of mansions set back from the street on with large tree-lined lawns. During this period, there was a good number of Victorian period houses. Victorian houses were really named after Britain's Queen Victoria. They reigned from 1837 to 1901. It was a period of rapid industrialization and growth of the railroads. The balloon framing that we talked about earlier made these mass-produced parts easily accessible around the country. Most Victorian-style homes were based on those medieval prototypes that we saw earlier, and these continued to be prominent until the end of the century. But following the American Centennial Exhibition of 1876, we start to see revival of some of those classical elements from the earlier colonial architecture start to creep back into the design of houses, and kind of some of these styles having a mix of Victorian elements and kind of classical elements. So there's a variety of these styles we're going to look at, many of which you might not think of as what we typically refer to as Victorian homes. First of these is Second Empire homes. They imitated the latest French building fashion, which incorporated mansard roofs named for the French architect Francois Mansard, which was revived in France during the reign of Napoleon III. The Second Empire style really became popular, starting with the exhibitions in Paris in 1850 1855 and 1867, and from there it spread to the United States. In the next slide, we see an example of this in Linwood, which was Boss Tweed's home on Putnam Ave. Identifying features of Second Empire homes include mansard roofs with dormers. They tended to have very boxy roof lines. They had molded cornices, normally bound by roofs sloped both above and below, decorative brackets beneath the eaves, and heavy trim details around the doors and the windows. And another example of this is the Thomas Higgins house on Putnam Ave, seen here. Also around this time, we see stick style. Stick style was a transitional style that linked the Gothic revival with the Queen Anne. It stressed wall surfaces as decorative elements themselves. Proponents lauded the structural honesty of this visible stickwork, which was in reality largely just applied decoration. Viewed from Millbank Ave is One Elm, which was located roughly where Whole Foods is today. It was certainly one of the grandest stick-style homes in the country, but was considered ugly by Greenwich residents and locals, and was torn down in 1904. The carriage house in the foreground is visible and still exists on Millbank Ave, and William Rockefeller moved from here to home along the Hudson River. You can see the attributes of the stick style here again, with gabled roofs, which are usually steeply pitched with crossed gables, commonly showing decorative trusses at the apex, overhanging eaves with exposed rafter tails, wooden wall cladding with interrupted patterns of horizontal and vertical diagonal boards, and porches commonly with diagonal or curved bracing. Queen Anne, popularized in the 19th century by architects led by Richard Norman Shaw, this style had little to do with Queen Anne or the formal Renaissance architecture dominant during her reign, and instead relied heavily on medieval models of the preceding Elizabethan and Jacobean period. Identifying features seen here of the Queen Anne style are steeply pitched roofs with irregular shapes, dominant front-facing gables, patterned shingles, bay windows, and other devices were used to smooth walls' appearances, asymmetrical facades with partial or full-width porches, which are usually 1 story high and extended along 1 or 2 different sides of the building, and other decorative elements commonly included spindlework, classical columns, and often patterned masonry with bold or colorful towers. So now moving on to the shingle style, we start to see this influence of the Colonial revival. Unlike most 19th century styles that preceded it, the shingle style doesn't emphasize the decorative elements at doors, windows, cornices, and porches, but instead aims for an effect of a complex shape enclosed within smooth wall surfaces, which unify the irregular outlines of the house. And here you see some examples in cottages along the shore in Old Greenwich. One of the earliest examples of shingle style was the Newport Casino, designed by McKim, Mead and White in 1881. Still there today and in beautiful shape. Identifying elements of the shingle style can be seen in these examples. And again, wall cladding and roofing with continuous wood shingles. No interruption at the corner, no corner boards. The shingles just wrap the corners. The roofs usually have intersecting cross gables and multiple level eaves. It's very common to have extensive number of porches. Towers are found in about 1/3 of these examples, and Palladian windows and simplified classical columns are borrowed from contemporary Colonial revival styles and incorporated into the shingle styles. Another interesting style, typically in masonry, is Richardson Romanesque. It was based on the European Romanesque models that became popular due to the influence of architect Henry Hobson Richardson, who trained at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris but worked out of New York and Boston offices. Richardson borrowed many sources, incorporating the polychrome walls of the late Gothic revival period, arches that were more Syrian than Roman, and contributed his own inventiveness to the structural shapes. Seen here is Jeremiah Milbank House, and you can see these identifying features of the Richardson Romanesque with the round top arches occurring over the windows and porch supports, and at the entrance, the masonry walls with very rustic faced stone, the polycomb treatment of the wall surfaces, and a tower. Many of these were round in shape, and the facades, again, having very asymmetrical compositions. Greenwich's Gilded Age was really from the time period of roughly 1880 up until the stock market crash in 1929. Greenwich had the highest per capita income in the country by the 1921, and it was a period marked with large homes and a transition to the suburban lifestyle. The period sees a full spectrum of architectural traditions, although Colonial and Tudor Revival were really the most prevalent. And unlike the stylistic mixtures of the Victorian period, we see relatively pure copies of the various European and American styles, with sharp lines drawn between the period homes and the modern styles. The masonry technology allowed homes to mimic the old world buildings at substantially less cost, and therefore we see a lot more of masonry construction and the development of the neighborhoods, which I mentioned earlier. The Colonial Revival period really was from that Philadelphia exhibition in 1876 up to the 1950s, and we see a full range of revival of English and Dutch architecture of the American colonies. We also see Georgian and Adams styles that are predominant, and publications such as the American Architect and Building News, along with the White Pine series of architectural monographs, are credited for promoting the revival of this colonial style. We see nice examples of the Colonial Revival here in Ashford and Rocklawn. Other examples here from Deer Park, Chieftains, and this Georgian from Clapboard Ridge, as well as in Victor Borge's old house that was on Field Point Circle. Neoclassical design became dominant also during the first half of the 20th century, which followed the World's Columbian Exhibition in Chicago in 1893. The exhibition was widely photographed and reported on, and although it had a number of large-scale buildings, there was also a number of small pavilions for each of the states, which were done on a more domestic scale and were instrumental in the neoclassical buildings that followed around the country. Identifying features of the neoclassical includes facades that were dominated by full-height porticos and roofs supported by tall columns, symmetrically balanced windows, usually with a centered door. Doorways commonly had elaborate decorative surrounds based on Greek Revival, Adams, or other precedents. The cornices have classical eaves, frequently with dentils or the larger blocks, which are called modillions. Windows are rectangular with double-hung sashes, but we also see the presence of bay windows and more paired or in windows or triple windows, transom windows, and arched windows that all help differentiate the neoclassical from the Greek Revival or the early classical revival examples. And roof lines here also tended to have balustrades. And here we have some other fine examples we see in Overlook Farm, at Nob Hill, in Maralta at Field Point Park. This brings us to the Tudor period. Tudor homes were based on the medieval English prototypes prominent from the reigns of Elizabeth I and James I, and ranged from thatch roof cottages all the way to grand manor houses. In these Greenwich examples seen at Horse Island and Old Mill Farm, you can see Tudor's identifying features, including steeply pitched roofs, prominent gables or hipped main roofs with one or more cross gables, decorative half timbering with stucco or brick infill, stone cladding, tall narrow windows, usually in multiple groups, Renaissance detailing at the doorways, and massive chimneys, often crowned with chimney pots. Other nice Tudor examples can be seen in the homes, such as You Like It, Dunallen Hall, the Priory, and Fairholme. And one of my favorite examples is the High-Low House at Khakum Wood, and here an example also from the Millbrook neighborhood. Greenwich also has many fine examples of Beaux-Arts homes. Beaux-Arts architecture is a broad term characterizing the classical architecture that was studied and came out of the French École des Beaux-Arts school in Paris. It was derived from the French term fine arts, and more than any other style, it was the architecture of America's industrial barons around the turn of the century. One of our finest examples is Cornelius Benedict's Indian Harbor residence, designed by Carrere and Hastings. Identifying features of this style include classically based design, typically symmetrical compositions, wall surfaces with decorative applications, facades with coins on the corner, those stone blocks on the corners, pilasters, and typically paired Ionic or Corinthian columns, walls of masonry, usually made of smooth or light-colored stone, and frequently rusticated first floor stonework at the base of the building. Seen here, Northway is an authorized reproduction of the Le Petit Trianon at Versailles and Percy Rockefeller's Owen Farm, which are also great examples of the Beaux-Arts architecture. This leads us up to the 20th century modern period. The modern period had two distinct phases. One was the arts and crafts phase, which was inspired by the English arts and crafts movement, and the second was the machine age, inspired by the European Bauhaus movement. The first of these arts and crafts phases was the Prairie style. It was a indigenous American style of architecture that originated with a creative group of Chicago architects, which included Louis Sullivan and Frank Lloyd Wright, and was spread through the country through a series of pattern books, such as this, Drawings and Plans of Frank Lloyd Wright, published in 1910. And in these Prairie-style influenced homes, we can see the attributes of the low-pitched roof, hipped, usually wide, overhanged eaves. Frequently, these homes had 2 stories with 1-story wings or porches, and there's an emphasis here you can see on the horizontal lines. The columns often supported with large square kind of blocky columns. And around the same time, you can see the Craftsman style, which was influenced by the English arts and crafts movement. This really started out west with the work of architects such as Green and Green in Pasadena, and was spread through publications such as House Beautiful, Good Housekeeping, Architectural Record, Ladies' Home Journal, etc. Identifying features of this craftsman style included still low-pitched roofs, gabled with gabled shapes, wide, unenclosed eave overhangs, exposed rafters, decorative beams or brackets, porches and roofs supported by tapered columns, and interiors which featured finely crafted and meticulously detailed woodwork. And we see an example here from Greenwich's Edward Slosson house in 1913. The international style was originally cultivated by Walter Gropius and others at the Bauhaus in Germany up until World War II, when many of these designers moved to the United States. Fundamentally, it championed an outright rejection of most traditional architectural styles, with an emphasis on functionalism and a rejection of purely decorative elements. Architects like Le Corbusier conceived of the house as a machine for living. Architects like Mies van der Rohe preached less is more, and the style was largely introduced to the U.S. in 1929 at the exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art curated by Philip Johnson. Walter Gropius was invited to head up the graduate school of design at Harvard, and after World War II, a group of 5 prominent modern architects with their shared academic affiliations moved to New Canaan and began to practice in the area. They were known as the Harvard Five, and most eventually designed homes in Greenwich. In the 1954 Walter Baris House addition in Deer Park Court, we see identifying modern elements such as the flat roofs with coping, with really no overhangs, windows set flush, usually done in metal and frequently arranged in groups, smooth, unornamented wall surfaces, asymmetrical facades, cantilevered projections, and the expression of structural honesty with the lower level exposed columns. Another example from this period is John Johansson's telephone pole, Ritz House in 1968. Interestingly, it used 40 telephone poles and braced the house on one side from the steep ravine that it faced. And this example in the Sereno House, 1972, by Marcel Breuer. So this leads us up to modern-day Greenwich. During this period, we continue to see design in Greenwich, kind of a tug of war between the promises of modern technology and the comfort and nostalgia of traditional architectural materials and form. It's an age of significant technological innovation. We see the impact of information technology and energy-saving innovations and new synthetic building materials. There's a broadening array of materials coming from sources around the world that are cheaper and easier to construct. And we see a delusion of cultural identity as building design becomes increasingly a matter of fashion rather than necessity, and rapid communication reaches us from almost all corners of the globe. So one of the first styles we see during this period is postmodern style. Postmodern movement really began with the publication of Robert Venturi's book Complexity and Contradictions in Architecture, where he rejects many of the modernist positions, arguing about the importance of responding to historical context and acknowledging the power of nostalgia. This is really a transitional style leading back toward the transitional. Stark steel and glass are abandoned in favor of return to more traditional palette of materials. Here you can see in the Peter Brandt house done by Venturi, Rout, and Scott Brown, 1970 to 74, is more stone and brick. On the exterior, we see a softer, more traditional palette of materials, and the house facade, while not exactly symmetrical, is fairly balanced. And here we see Robert Stern gesturing back toward the New England shingle style in his Greenwich pool house. It's a relatively contemporary composition, but done in traditional materials. And on the right are two Chopin and Wharton designs using traditional materials and strong symmetry, returning to the use of classical ornament. And then the pendulum comes full swing with another wave of traditional revival in the early 1980s. Here are three Alan Greenberg projects. These are wood and brick Georgians and reflect another colonial revival. We see examples here from Dinyar Wadia, who tends to favor the more European styles, and some classic Georgian homes from my firm, along with French influences from our work at Sleepy Cat Farm, and down in Riverside, one of our shingle-style homes. From 2000 forward, modernism has really come back in a big way, and here we see examples from Joe Moore and David Austin, other examples from Roger Ferris, Rich Granoff, and Murdoch Salon. And maybe the most common requests that we get today are for fairly traditional exteriors, but with much cleaner and more contemporary or transitional interiors. And these interiors are from a Greenwich home we completed just a few years ago. Which brings us up to today. Predictions for the future. I think we're going to continue to see a very pluralistic approach to design as influences pour in from around the globe. In the short run, at least, I think we'll continue to see a trend toward much more modern interiors, and I think house sizes will continue to increase over time. Traditional and building materials will continue to be supplemented by more and more man-made products that are cheaper and more durable and consistent, more predictable and readily available than our dwindling natural resources. I expect and think that our homes will be greener, that there'll be more recycled products, and certainly more energy efficiency, which are being demanded by homeowners and mandated by code developers. And finally, spaces like home offices, indoor-outdoor living spaces, home entertainment spaces, and healthy home amenities will continue to be in strong demand. Thank you all so much for your time today.